The rain poured relentlessly that night, the kind of downpour that made the world feel cold and unforgiving. On a dimly lit street corner, a wealthy man named Arthur Whitmore sat in the back of his chauffeured car, staring out at the city he had once called his kingdom. His sharp eyes caught sight of a frail figure huddled under a tattered blanket, shivering against the biting wind. It was a young woman, no older than 25, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow yet strangely resilient. Arthur was no stranger to acts of charity. As a self-made millionaire, he had built his fortune through shrewd business deals and a relentless drive for success. But his wealth had come at a cost. His son, Ethan, now lay bedridden at home, battling a rare illness that no amount of money could cure. Arthur had tried everything, the best doctors, experimental treatments, even prayers whispered in the dead of night. Nothing worked. Something about the girl on the street corner stirred him. Perhaps it was the way she clutched a small, worn notebook to her chest, or the way her eyes seemed to hold a story too heavy for her fragile frame. Against his driver's advice, Arthur stepped out of the car and approached her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The girl looked up, startled. "Clara," she replied softly, her voice barely audible over the rain. Arthur hesitated for a moment before making an offer that would change both their lives. "I have a son who's very sick. He needs someone to care for him. If you're willing, I'll give you a warm bed, food, and a purpose. But I need to know, can I trust you?" Clara's eyes widened, and for the first time, a flicker of hope broke through her weariness. She nodded, and Arthur helped her into the car. Days turned into weeks, and Clara proved to be more than Arthur could have hoped for. She was gentle with Ethan, patient and attentive in ways the hired nurses had never been. She would sit by his bedside for hours, reading to him or simply holding his hand. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ethan began to show signs of improvement. His color returned, and he started to murmur in his sleep, words that no one could quite make out. But Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Clara was too good to be true, her past too shrouded in mystery. One evening, after a particularly restless night, Arthur made a decision that would unravel everything. He installed a hidden camera in Ethan's room, determined to uncover the truth about the girl he had brought into his home. What he saw would leave him questioning not only Clara's intentions but also his own. Clara's arrival at the Whitmore estate was met with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The staff, accustomed to the comings and goings of hired help, eyed her warily. She was unlike anyone they had seen before, quiet, unassuming, yet carrying an air of quiet strength. Arthur had given her a simple room on the second floor, not far from Ethan's suite. It was modest but clean, a far cry from the cold streets she had called home. From the very first day, Clara's dedication to Ethan was evident. She spent hours by his bedside, her presence a calming force in the otherwise tense household. Ethan, who had been unresponsive for months, seemed to sense her in a way he hadn't with others. His eyes would flicker open occasionally, and though he couldn't speak, his gaze would follow her as she moved about the room. Arthur watched from a distance, his initial relief giving way to a gnawing unease. Clara was too perfect, too attuned to Ethan's needs. She seemed to know exactly what to do, as if she had been trained for this role. Yet, when Arthur asked about her past, her answers were vague. "I've always been good with people," she said one evening, her eyes avoiding his. "Especially those who are hurting." Arthur pressed further, but Clara deflected his questions with a skill that only deepened his suspicion. She spoke of growing up in a small town, of losing her parents young, of drifting from place to place. But there were gaps in her story, details that didn't quite add up. One night, unable to sleep, Arthur decided to review the footage from the hidden camera. He had installed it just days earlier, driven by a growing paranoia he couldn't quite explain. The screen flickered to life, showing Ethan's dimly lit room. Clara was there, as she always was, sitting by his bedside. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Clara was reading aloud from a book, her voice soft and soothing. But then, as the hours passed, something changed. Ethan, who had been still and silent, began to stir. His lips moved, forming words that were too faint to hear. Clara leaned closer, her face a mask of concentration. Arthur rewound the footage, his heart pounding. He played it again, this time turning up the volume. What he heard sent a chill down his spine. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to." Clara's response was even more startling. "It's okay," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Arthur froze, his mind racing. What was Ethan apologizing for? And why did Clara seem to understand? The next morning, Arthur confronted Clara, his tone sharper than he intended. "What happened last night?" he demanded. "What did Ethan say to you?" Clara's face paled, but she held his gaze. "He's starting to remember," she said quietly. "But it's not my place to tell you." "Not yet." Arthur's suspicion deepened, but so did his curiosity. Who was this girl, and what secrets was she hiding? Arthur's nights became consumed by the footage from the hidden camera. He watched intently, rewinding and replaying every moment Clara spent with Ethan. The more he watched, the more he noticed subtle details that unsettled him. Clara's interactions with Ethan were tender, almost maternal, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something Arthur couldn't quite put his finger on. One particular night, the footage revealed something extraordinary. Ethan, who had been silent for months, began to speak in his sleep. His words were fragmented, disjointed, but they carried a weight that made Arthur's chest tighten. "I didn't mean to. I was scared," Ethan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara, sitting by his bedside, leaned in closer. Her hand brushed his forehead gently, and she whispered back, "It's not your fault. You were just a child." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. What was Ethan talking about? And why did Clara seem to know more than she was letting on? He rewound the footage again, his hands trembling as he turned up the volume. The next morning, Arthur confronted Clara, his patience wearing thin. "What did Ethan mean last night?" he demanded, his voice low but firm. "What are you hiding from me?" Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "I can't tell you," she said finally. "Not yet." "He's not ready." Arthur's frustration boiled over. "Not ready for what? What aren't you telling me?" Clara's voice was calm but resolute. "Ethan's memories are starting to surface. But they're painful, and he needs time to process them. If I push him too hard, it could set him back." Arthur stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to trust her, but the pieces of the puzzle weren't adding up. Why did Clara seem to know so much about Ethan's past? And what was she hiding about her own? Later that day, Arthur decided to search Clara's room. It felt like a violation, but his desperation outweighed his guilt. He found little at first: a few clothes, a well-worn notebook, and a small photograph tucked inside a drawer. The photo showed a younger Clara, standing beside a man who looked strikingly familiar. Arthur's heart skipped a beat as he realized who it was: Thomas Grayson, his former business partner and a man he hadn't seen in over a decade. The discovery sent Arthur's mind spiraling. Thomas had been more than a partner, he had been a friend. But their relationship had ended in betrayal, a bitter falling out that had left Thomas ruined and Arthur haunted by guilt. Arthur's hands shook as he held the photo. Clara was Thomas's daughter. And she had come into his home, not by chance, but with a purpose. That night, Arthur returned to the camera footage, his unease growing with every passing moment. He watched as Clara sat by Ethan's bedside, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. She was writing in her notebook, her movements deliberate and focused. Arthur zoomed in, trying to make out the words on the page. He couldn't read them, but he noticed something else, a small, folded piece of paper tucked into the notebook spine. It was the same paper he had seen in the footage days earlier, the one Clara had been clutching when he first found her on the street. The next morning, Arthur made a decision. He would confront Clara again, but this time, he would demand the truth. No more evasions, no more secrets. As he walked into Ethan's room, he found Clara sitting by the bed, her notebook open on her lap. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," Arthur said, his voice steady but firm. "And this time, I want the whole story." Clara closed her notebook slowly, her eyes meeting his. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said quietly. "But you might not like what you hear." Arthur's confrontation with Clara left him more unsettled than before. Her cryptic words echoed in his mind, "You might not like what you hear." He needed answers, and he wasn't going to wait for Clara to reveal them on her own terms. Determined to uncover the truth, Arthur decided to take matters into his own hands. The next morning, he contacted a private investigator named Victor Hayes, a man known for his discretion and efficiency. Arthur provided Victor with what little information he had: Clara's name, her connection to Thomas Grayson, and the photograph he had found in her room. "Find out everything you can about her," Arthur instructed. "I need to know who she is and why she's here." Victor got to work immediately, and within days, he began to uncover fragments of Clara's past. The first revelation came as a shock. Clara had once been a medical student, enrolled in a prestigious university. But she had dropped out abruptly, leaving behind a promising career. The reason for her departure was unclear, but rumors suggested it was tied to a personal tragedy. Arthur's unease deepened. If Clara had medical training, why had she never mentioned it? And why had she chosen to live on the streets instead of pursuing her education? The next piece of the puzzle came from Thomas Grayson's past. Victor discovered that Thomas had died several years earlier under mysterious circumstances. His business had collapsed after a devastating fallout with Arthur, and he had spiraled into depression. Clara, his only child, had been left to fend for herself. Arthur felt a pang of guilt as he listened to Victor's report. He had played a role in Thomas's downfall, though he had never intended for things to go so far. The memory of their final argument still haunted him, a heated exchange that had ended their partnership and their friendship. But the most startling revelation came when Victor uncovered a connection between Clara and Ethan. Years earlier, when Ethan was just a child, he had been involved in a car accident. The details were murky, but it appeared that Thomas Grayson had been present at the scene. Clara, who was a teenager at the time, had also been there. Arthur's mind raced as he tried to piece together the timeline. What had happened that day? And why had Clara never mentioned it? That evening, Arthur confronted Clara again, this time armed with the information Victor had uncovered. He found her in Ethan's room, as usual, sitting by his bedside. "I know who you are," Arthur said, his voice low but firm. "You're Thomas Grayson's daughter. And you were there the day of Ethan's accident." Clara's face paled, but she didn't deny it. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was there." Arthur's heart pounded. "What happened that day? And why didn't you tell me?" Clara hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "It's not my story to tell," she said finally. "But if you want the truth, you need to ask Ethan." Arthur stared at her, stunned. "Ethan? He was just a child. He doesn't remember." Clara's gaze softened. "He's starting to," she said. "And when he does, it's going to change everything." Arthur left the room, his mind reeling. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was one he wasn't ready to face. That night, he returned to the camera footage, watching as Clara sat by Ethan's bedside. She was writing in her notebook again, her movements slow and deliberate. Arthur zoomed in, trying to make out the words on the page. This time, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Written in bold letters at the top of the page were two words: "Forgive him." The words, "forgive him," lingered in Arthur's mind like a haunting refrain. What did they mean? Who was Clara referring to? And why had she written them in her notebook? The questions gnawed at him, but the answers remained just out of reach. Determined to uncover the truth, Arthur decided to take a closer look at Clara's notebook. He waited until she left Ethan's room for a brief moment, then slipped inside and retrieved it from the bedside table. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, each one filled with Clara's neat, precise handwriting. The notebook was a mix of medical notes, personal reflections, and sketches. But one entry stood out, a detailed account of the day of Ethan's accident. Arthur's breath caught as he read the words. "I was there that day. I saw everything. Ethan was just a child, but he was so scared. He didn't mean to do it. None of us did. But the guilt has followed us ever since." Arthur's heart pounded as he continued reading. Clara's account revealed a truth he had never known: the accident that had left Ethan bedridden for years had not been an accident at all. It had been the result of a terrible mistake, a moment of panic that had changed everything. According to Clara's notes, Ethan had been playing near the road when a car came speeding around the corner. Thomas Grayson, who had been walking nearby, had rushed to pull Ethan to safety. But in the chaos, Ethan had panicked and pulled away, causing Thomas to lose his balance. The car had swerved, crashing into a tree. Thomas had been gravely injured, and Ethan had been left with a traumatic brain injury. Arthur's hands shook as he closed the notebook. The weight of the revelation was almost too much to bear. For years, he had blamed himself for Ethan's condition, believing it was the result of his own negligence. But the truth was far more complicated, and far more painful. That evening, Arthur confronted Clara again, this time with the notebook in hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice trembling with emotion. "Why did you let me believe it was my fault?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to," she said softly. "But I didn't know how. I was afraid of what it would do to you, to all of us." Arthur sank into a chair, his mind reeling. The guilt he had carried for so long was suddenly replaced by a different kind of pain, the pain of knowing that Ethan had been carrying his own burden of guilt all these years. "He remembers, doesn't he?" Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara nodded. "Bits and pieces. It's coming back to him slowly. But he's not ready to face it yet." Arthur buried his face in his hands, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "What do we do now?" he asked. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "We help him," she said. "We help him forgive himself." The days that followed were a blur of tension and quiet breakthroughs. Ethan's condition continued to improve, but his newfound awareness came with a cost. He began to have nightmares, his sleep punctuated by cries of fear and guilt. Arthur and Clara took turns sitting by his bedside, offering what comfort they could. One night, as Arthur watched over Ethan, he heard his son murmur something in his sleep. Leaning closer, he caught the words, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Arthur's heart ached. He reached out and gently took Ethan's hand, his voice soft but steady. "It's okay, son. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Ethan's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in years, they focused clearly on Arthur. "Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse but lucid. Arthur's breath caught. "I'm here, Ethan. I'm right here." Ethan's grip tightened on his father's hand. "I remember," he said, his voice trembling. "I remember the accident. I was so scared. I didn't mean to pull away. I didn't mean to hurt him." Tears filled Arthur's eyes as he realized the depth of his son's guilt. "It wasn't your fault, Ethan," he said firmly. "You were just a child. You didn't know what would happen. Ethan shook his head, his face crumpling with emotion. But I did it. I caused the accident. And now he's gone. Arthur hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. He glanced at Clara, who had entered the room quietly and was standing by the door. Her expression was calm but encouraging, as if urging him to trust the process. Ethan, Arthur said carefully, there's something you need to know. Clara, she was there that day. She knows what happened. And she's been helping you remember because she wants you to heal. Ethan's eyes widened as he turned to look at Clara. You were there? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara stepped forward, her expression gentle but resolute. I was, she said. And I've carried the guilt of that day just like you have. But it's time to let it go, Ethan. It's time to forgive yourself. Ethan's face crumpled, and he began to sob, deep, wrenching cries that seemed to come from the very core of his being. Arthur held him tightly, his own tears mingling with his son's. Clara stood by, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of emotions. Over the next few days, Ethan's recovery accelerated. He began to speak more clearly, his memories of the accident coming back in fragments. With each revelation, Arthur and Clara worked to help him process the guilt and pain he had carried for so long. But as Ethan grew stronger, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story. Clara's role in all of this remained unclear, and her connection to Thomas Grayson weighed heavily on his mind. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Arthur turned to Clara. You've done so much for Ethan, he said. But I need to know, why did you come here? Was it just to help him, or was there something else? Clara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I came here because I needed to make peace with the past, she said finally. But I stayed because I saw how much you both needed healing. And because I think I needed it too. Arthur nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of peace. The air in the Whitmore estate was thick with unspoken tension. Ethan's awakening had brought relief, but it had also unearthed emotions that had long been buried. Arthur knew it was time to confront Clara, not as a suspicious employer, but as someone seeking the full truth. One evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Arthur asked Clara to join him in the study. The room was dimly lit, the shelves lined with books and mementos from a life that now felt distant. Clara entered quietly, her expression calm but guarded. We need to talk, Arthur began, his voice steady but firm. I've trusted you with my son's life, but there are still things I don't understand. Why did you really come here? And what is your connection to Thomas Grayson? Clara took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I came here because of my father, she said finally. Because of what happened to him, and because of what happened to Ethan. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. Tell me everything. Clara's voice was soft but unwavering as she began to recount the story. My father and you were once close. He admired you, trusted you. But when your business deal went wrong, he lost everything. He couldn't handle the shame, the guilt. He became a shell of the man he once was. Arthur's chest tightened. He remembered the fallout vividly, the arguments, the accusations, the bitter end to a partnership that had once been built on mutual respect. After the accident, Clara continued, my father blamed himself. He believed that if he hadn't been so distracted by his failures, he could have prevented it. He spent the rest of his life haunted by what happened to Ethan, and to you. Arthur's eyes widened. He told you about the accident? Clara nodded. He did. But he also told me something else. He said that you were a good man, a man who had made mistakes but didn't deserve to carry the weight of them forever. He wanted me to find you, to help you and Ethan heal. Arthur sat back, stunned. So this was his idea? Not exactly, Clara admitted. At first, I came because I wanted to understand. I wanted to see the man who had destroyed my father's life. But when I saw Ethan, when I saw how much pain you were both in, I realized that my father was right. You didn't deserve to suffer any more than he did. Arthur's mind raced as he processed her words. The guilt he had carried for years, the guilt over Ethan's accident, over Thomas's downfall, felt heavier than ever. But for the first time, he also felt a glimmer of hope. "What about you?" he asked quietly. "What do you want from all of this?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I want to forgive you," she said. "And I want to forgive myself. For carrying this anger for so long, for blaming you for my father's death. But most of all, I want to help Ethan, and you, find peace." Arthur felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent years building walls around his heart, shielding himself from the pain of his past. But now, faced with Clara's honesty, those walls began to crumble. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "For everything. For what happened to your father, for what happened to Ethan, for all of it." Clara reached out and placed a hand on his. "I know," she said softly. "And I forgive you." The room fell silent, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. For the first time in years, Arthur felt a sense of release, a lightness he hadn't known was possible. The days that followed the confrontation were marked by a quiet transformation. Arthur, Ethan, and Clara began to rebuild their lives, not as strangers bound by tragedy, but as a family united by forgiveness and hope. Ethan's recovery continued to progress, his physical strength returning alongside a newfound emotional resilience. One evening, as the three of them sat together in the garden, Ethan turned to Clara with a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Clara," he began hesitantly, "why did you stay? After everything that happened, why did you choose to help us?" Clara smiled, her gaze soft but thoughtful. "Because I saw something in you both," she said. "I saw pain, yes, but I also saw strength. And I realized that helping you heal was the only way I could heal, too." Arthur nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. Clara's presence had been a gift, one he hadn't known he needed. But there was still one question that lingered, one piece of the puzzle that remained unresolved. Later that night, as Arthur reviewed the footage from the hidden camera one last time, he noticed something he had missed before. In the corner of the screen, barely visible, was a small object tucked under Ethan's pillow. Curious, he went to Ethan's room and gently lifted the pillow. There, nestled beneath it, was a folded piece of paper. Arthur's hands trembled as he unfolded it, revealing a handwritten note in Clara's distinctive script. To Ethan, it began. "You are stronger than you know. The past doesn't define you. Forgive yourself, as I have forgiven you. And know that you are loved." Arthur's eyes filled with tears as he read the words. Clara's kindness, her compassion, had been a beacon of light in their darkest moments. And now, as he held the note in his hands, he realized the depth of her sacrifice. The next morning, Arthur found Clara in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. He handed her the note, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done so much for us," he said. "But what about you? What do you want for your future?" Clara hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've spent so long living in the past," she said. "But now, I think I'm ready to move forward. To build a life of my own." Arthur nodded, a sense of determination settling over him. "Then let us help you," he said. "You've given us so much. It's time we gave something back." Together, they made a plan. Arthur offered to fund Clara's return to medical school, giving her the opportunity to finish what she had started so many years ago. Clara accepted with gratitude, her heart full of hope for the future. As the weeks passed, the Whitmore estate became a place of healing and renewal. Ethan grew stronger every day, his laughter filling the halls once more. Clara began her studies, her passion for medicine reignited. And Arthur, finally free from the weight of his guilt, found a sense of peace he had thought was lost forever. But the greatest gift of all was the bond they had formed, a bond forged in forgiveness, strengthened by love, and rooted in the belief that even the deepest wounds can heal. The years that followed were a testament to the power of forgiveness and second chances. Ethan, now fully recovered, pursued his passion for art, his paintings filled with the vibrant colors of a life reclaimed. Clara graduated from medical school with honors, her journey from the streets to the operating room inspiring countless others. And Arthur, once a man burdened by guilt, found joy in the simple moments, watching his son thrive, supporting Clara's dreams, and giving back to the community that had once judged him. One crisp autumn evening, the three of them gathered in the garden, the place where so many pivotal conversations had taken place. The air was filled with the scent of fallen leaves and the soft glow of twilight. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a chance to look back on how far they had come. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Arthur smiled, his gaze thoughtful. "Every day," he said. "But I've learned that it's not about what could have been. It's about what we do with the time we have now." Clara nodded, her expression warm. "And what we've done is pretty remarkable," she said. "We've turned pain into purpose, and guilt into grace." Ethan reached out and took Clara's hand, his voice soft but sincere. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly," he said. "For everything you've done for me, for us." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "Seeing you heal, that's been my greatest reward." Arthur watched the exchange, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had also been filled with moments of profound beauty, moments that had changed them all for the better. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the garden, Arthur spoke the words that had been weighing on his heart. "I used to think that success was measured by wealth, by power, by control," he said. "But I was wrong. True success is about connection, about love, about the courage to forgive, not just others, but ourselves." Ethan and Clara nodded, their faces reflecting the truth of his words. In that moment, they were more than a family bound by circumstance, they were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The story of Arthur, Ethan, and Clara became a beacon of hope for those who heard it, a reminder that no matter how broken we may feel, there is always a path to healing. It was a story of redemption, of second chances, and of the transformative power of forgiveness. And as they sat together in the garden, surrounded by the beauty of a life rebuilt, they knew that their journey was far from over. But whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, united by love, strengthened by forgiveness, and guided by the belief that even the darkest nights can give way to the brightest dawns. Life lesson. Sometimes, the greatest acts of kindness come from the most unexpected places. And forgiveness, both of others and of ourselves, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. In the end, it's not the mistakes we make that define us, but how we choose to rise from them.